Welcome. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath find its own slow rhythm, and let today's weight settle somewhere behind you. Tonight we walk along coastlines that no longer exist, through villages the sea has kept for itself. There is nowhere to arrive, nothing to remember. Just let the tide carry this story in, and let it carry you toward sleep. Doggerland was a landmass connecting Britain to mainland Europe, where the North Sea now spreads gray and endless. Hunters once walked dry ground between forests and river valleys. Reindeer moved across its plains, and smoke from cooking fires drifted over marsh grass. It stretched wide enough to hold lakes, hills, and slow-winding rivers. Today it lies entirely beneath water, unseen by anyone who crosses it by boat. Hunters camped on Doggerland's marshes 8,000 years ago. They built shelters from reed and hide near slow-moving streams where fish and waterfowl were plentiful. Antler tools were shaped by hand, then left behind in the mud when a camp moved on. Children likely played along the reed banks while elders worked the fires. The marsh gave them everything they needed for a season. A tsunami from the Storegga landslide reshaped Doggerland's coast. Far to the north, an underwater slope gave way, sending a wave rolling across the shallow seas. It reached low-lying camps and marshes, reworking riverbanks and burying old hearths under silt. The land did not vanish that day, but its shape was never quite the same again. Life on Doggerland continued, though the shoreline had shifted. Fishing trawlers still pull up ancient antler tools from the North Sea floor. Nets meant for herring sometimes bring in a barbed point or a worked bone, pale and heavy with age. Crews have learned to set these odd finds aside on deck, unsure at first what they were holding. Museums along the English and Dutch coasts now keep drawers full of such pieces. Each one traveled up through cold water from a world that used to be dry land. Peat deposits beneath the waves mark old Doggerland forests. Divers and dredging crews have found dark, compressed layers where oak and birch once stood. Tree roots, still recognizable, sit tangled in mud far below the surf. The peat holds pollen that tells of woodland floors, thick with fern and moss. It is a forest floor, resting now under decades of tide instead of leaves. The submerged forest at Boldner Cliff held work timber. Off the coast of the Isle of Wight, archaeologists found wood-bearing, clear-cut marks shaped by tools rather than by chance. The site also yielded traces of wheat, though farming was not thought to have reached Britain yet in that era. It left a small, unresolved puzzle about how far early trade and travel truly went. The timber itself remained simply what it always was: wood, carefully worked and long underwater. A single flint blade dredged near the brown bank told of old campsites. Fishermen working that stretch of sandbank once found the blade caught among shells and gravel. Its edge was still sharp enough to notice, chipped with the same patient hand used thousands of years before boats crossed that spot. Archaeologists later matched its style to tools found on dry Mesolithic sites elsewhere in Europe. One small stone carried the memory of a whole vanished shoreline. Doggerland's rivers once flowed where oil rigs now stand. Geologists studying seismic survey data have traced their old channels winding beneath the seabed, complete with bends and floodplains. Engineers, drilling for gas, sometimes cross paths with these buried valleys without ever seeing them. The rivers carried silt toward a coastline that has long since moved elsewhere. Their courses remain fixed underground, unchanged even as the sea above them shifts with every tide. Sea levels rose slowly enough that generations barely noticed the change. A family might have seen a marsh grow wetter, a favored fishing spot shift a little farther inland, nothing more dramatic than that within a single lifetime. Only across centuries did the water's advance become undeniable. By the time the land was gone, no one living had ever known it as anything but sea. The change was real, but it never announced itself. A seabed survey mapped Doggerland's lost river valleys from sonar data. Oil companies exploring the North Sea floor for drilling routes had gathered years of acoustic soundings, without realizing their scientific worth. Researchers later assembled that data into detailed maps of ancient rivers, lakes, and low hills, spread across an area larger than many countries above water. The work turned commercial survey charts into something closer to an atlas of a vanished world. What had been noise on old readouts became a landscape again. Land between Britain and the rest of Europe held on for a long stretch after the first floods began. By roughly 7,000 years ago, the last dry paths had gone under for good. What had been walkable ground became open channel, then open sea. Ships now cross water where herds once grazed. No ceremony marked the day, because no single day did it. Shellfish middens along England's eastern beaches hold traces of that vanished shoreline. Heaps of oyster and cockle shells, packed into old dune hollows, mark meals eaten by people who once looked out over dry Doggerland rather than open sea. Layers of ash and cracked stone sit beneath the shells, left by fires long cold. The middens face a coastline that has since moved miles inland. What was once a kitchen midden near a riverbank now sits within sound of the surf. Hellike stood on the Gulf of Corinth as a wealthy city in ancient Greece. Its streets held bronze workshops, grain stores, and homes built close along the shore. Traders came through its harbor, carrying oil, wine, and worked metal from across the Peloponnese. The city's wealth was known widely enough that other Greek towns looked to it as a model. Hate's name carried weight long before the sea took it. A temple to Poseidon stood above Helike's harbor, watching over the boats below. Bronze offerings lined its inner chamber, gifts from sailors grateful for safe crossings. The temple's columns rose near the edge of a wide stone platform overlooking the water. Priests kept the sanctuary through generations, tending rites tied closely to the sea's moods. It was, by long tradition, one of the most honored shrines to Poseidon anywhere in Greece. Earthquake and waves struck Hike on a winter night. Tremors split the ground first, toppling walls across the sleeping town. A wave followed soon after, rolling in from the Gulf and pushing over what still stood. By morning, most of the city sat beneath water and silt. The harbor that once welcomed ships had become the very thing that erased them. The historian Pausanias, writing centuries afterward, recorded Helike's disappearance beneath the Gulf. He described a city once counted among the finest on that coast, gone from the surface of the land within a single night. His account drew on older writers and local memory, since no eyewitness testimony had survived to his own time. Pausanias noted that the temple to Poseidon had vanished along with the rest. His brief passage became one of the few written anchors historians would later have for the event. Fishermen along that stretch of Gulf reported, for centuries afterward, seeing ruins beneath clear water. Ancient writers mentioned columns and walls visible on calm days, when the sea lay still enough to look straight down. Sailors passing overhead sometimes glimpsed shapes they took for streets. No one could agree on exactly where the city had settled beneath the silt. The stories persisted long after most people had stopped expecting anyone to find it. Archaeologists eventually located Hike's remains beneath layers of silt and old lagoon mud, not directly under the Gulf itself. Years of geological surveys and test trenches near the modern coastline led researchers to building foundations, roof tiles, and coins buried well inland from the current shore. The city, it turned out, had been swallowed by a shifting lagoon, rather than resting permanently under open sea. Pottery and coins found among the ruins helped date the destruction to the 4th century, before the Common Era. The old fishermen's tales of columns under clear water had pointed searchers toward the right coast, even if the truth lay buried in mud rather than waves. Baiae grew into a resort town on the Bay of Naples, favored by wealthy Romans seeking rest and warm springs. Senators and emperors kept villas along its curving shore, drawn by mineral waters said to ease the body. The town's baths and pleasure gardens made it a byword for luxury across the empire. Writers of the time both praised its comforts and criticized its excess. Baiae's name alone signaled leisure to anyone in Rome. Villas along Baiae's shore were built with heated pools fed by nearby volcanic springs. Pipes carried warm water beneath marble floors, letting bathers linger through cooler months without discomfort. Mosaic tiles lined many of these pools, some patterned with sea creatures fitting for a town built so close to the water. Wealthy families competed openly over whose villa held the finest baths. The whole shoreline hummed with a kind of idle, well-funded comfort. Let your weight settle now, fully, into whatever is holding you. Feel your shoulders grow heavy first, sinking a little further with each breath out. Let that heaviness spread down through your arms, your hands, your fingers, until they feel too full of sleep to move. Your legs follow, then your feet, heavy as riverbed stones. Nothing in you needs to hold itself up anymore. You can let the mattress do all the work now. Volcanic ground beneath Baiae has been sinking for centuries. The whole bay sits atop a caldera that breathes slowly, rising and falling as underground chambers shift. Roman engineers who built those grand villas had no name for the process, only the evidence of foundations settling year by year. Harbor walls that once stood firm slipped gradually toward the water. The town's undoing came not from a single storm, but from ground that never stopped moving beneath it. Roman mosaic floors now lie several meters under the bay's water. Patterns of dolphins and seahorses, once walked on by senators in dry sandals, sit beneath a shifting layer of silt and current. Divers who first mapped the site found entire rooms still holding their shape, walls low but intact. Fish move now where dinner guests once reclined. The floors have kept their color remarkably well, protected all this time by the very water that buried them. Divers today swim over Baiae's submerged marble columns. They rise from the seabed at odd angles, some still upright, others toppled and half buried in sand. A section of the site was set aside as an underwater archaeological park, allowing visitors to glide past statues and paved streets without disturbing them. Sunlight filters down in shifting bands, catching the white stone. What was once a shoreline of leisure has become a quiet stretch of the sea floor. Pavlopatry off the coast of Laconia held streets now underwater. Rows of stone foundations still trace out courtyards, corridors, and the outlines of rooms laid down long before Helike or Baia existed. The settlement sits in shallow water close enough to shore that its shape can be traced without deep diving. Wells and graves belonging to the vanished town remain visible among the seagrass. It is counted among the oldest submerged towns known anywhere in the world. Pavlopatry's building foundations remain visible from a boat above. On calm days, with the sun high and the water still, the old street grid shows through the surface like a map drawn in stone. Boatmen from nearby villages have pointed out the shapes to visitors for generations, long before archaeologists arrived with cameras and measuring lines. The site sits close enough to the beach that swimmers can drift right over the walls. Time has kept the plan of the town remarkably whole. Pottery shards dated Pavlopatry's drowning to the Bronze Age. Archaeologists surveying the site collected fragments of storage jars and cooking vessels scattered among the sunken walls. Their shapes and glazing matched styles known from mainland settlements of roughly the same period. The dating placed the town's submersion long before Helike, long before Rome existed at all. A scatter of broken clay, gathered piece by piece from the seabed, gave the ruins a place in time. Alexandria's royal quarter slipped into its harbor after earthquakes and slow subsidence. The palaces, temples, and grand avenues built along the city's waterfront settled gradually beneath the waves over several centuries. Some of the movement came in sudden shocks, recorded in ancient accounts of tremors along the Egyptian coast. Much of it came from the land itself, simply giving way beneath the weight of stone. What had been the heart of a great capital became a stretch of harbor floor. Divers found statues of Ptolemaic queens resting on the harbor floor. Their carved faces, worn smooth by centuries of current, lay among broken columns and pieces of sphinxes. Some figures still stood upright, half sunk in silt, as though the sea had simply grown up around them. Archaeologists working in the harbor since the late 20th century catalogued hundreds of such pieces. Each one had waited, unseen, in the dark water for longer than most nations have existed. Cleopatra's palace complex is believed to lie beneath Alexandria's eastern harbor. Archaeologists have traced fallen columns, paving stones, and fragments of sphinxes to a site once occupied by royal buildings near the old shoreline. No inscription has ever confirmed the exact rooms where she lived. The identification rests on location, layout, and centuries of careful comparison with ancient descriptions of the city. The harbor keeps its answer close, offering only stone and silence. Tideless waters kept many drowned Mediterranean towns remarkably undisturbed. Without the daily pull of tides, sediment settled slowly rather than being scored and reshaped season after season. Columns at Baiae, walls at Pavlopatri, and harbor ruins near Alexandria all kept much of their original layout intact. Silence held. Elsewhere, tidal coasts would treat their own lost towns far less gently. Somewhere beyond the room, a low hum rises and fades, arriving like a tide of its own. Maybe it is wind moving through a distant gutter, or the settling creak of an old house cooling in the night. It swells, then pulls back. Let your shoulders drop with it, as though that sound had been holding some small weight for you. Each time it returns, let it carry a little more of the day away. Dunwich once ranked among England's busiest ports. Its harbor drew wool traders, wine merchants, and fishing fleets from across the North Sea. Warehouses near the water held barrels, coiled rope, and stacked cloth. Ships crowded the quay. Few travelers passing through could have guessed how briefly that busyness would last. By the 12th century, Dunwich held churches, monasteries, and a market square lined with stalls. Records describe as many as 8 parish churches serving the town's population. Monks kept gardens and infirmaries near the town's edge. Bakers, tanners, and rope makers filled the streets with their daily trades. The town felt permanent, built in stone and habit alike. Storms through the 1200s began gnawing at Dunwich's cliffs. Each winter took a little more sand and clay from beneath the town's outer streets. Houses nearest the shore were abandoned first, their timbers salvaged before the ground gave way. Church wardens noted the losses in parish accounts, tallying land lost acre by acre. The sea worked slowly, but it worked without pause. A great storm, arriving in the year 1286, swallowed much of Dunwich's remaining streets. Harbor works, market stalls, and rows of houses gave way within a single tide. Survivors salvaged what timber and stone they could carry inland. What had been a thriving port center became open water by morning. Later storms in that same century took even more. Fishermen along that coast told of bells still tolling beneath the waves, rung by Dunwich's drowned churches. Boats passing over the old harbor at night sometimes carried word of the sound rising through fog. The tale spread inland, told at firesides for generations. No sailor ever claimed to have seen the bells themselves. Only the sound, they said, still reached the surface. Other locals insisted the sound was nothing more than surf dragging over shingle. Waves moving loose stones along the shoreline can carry a low bell-like ring on certain tides. Coastal families passed down both explanations without ever settling which was true. Each version suited a different kind of evening. The sea, either way, kept making its own sound. Dunwich's final church slid into the sea early in the 20th century. All Saints' Tower had stood alone on the cliff edge for years, its churchyard already lost to erosion. Photographs from those decades show gravestones tilting toward the drop. Local residents watched the tower lean further with each passing winter. When it finally fell, only a few witnesses were there to see it. Sonar surveys carried out along that stretch of coast later mapped Dunwich's sunken street plan across the seabed. Researchers traced the outlines of church foundations, harbor walls, and old road alignments beneath the sand. Their charts matched medieval descriptions of the town almost exactly. What had been rumor for centuries became a measured map. The lost streets, it turned out, had never really gone far. A sandbank near the mouth of the Humber gave rise to the port town of Ravensor-Odd. Fishermen built the first huts there, timber and turf against the wind. The channel beside it ran deep enough for seagoing ships. Merchants noticed, within a generation, warehouses lined its single muddy street, and vessels from Flanders and the Baltic coast tied up along the wharves. Ravensor-Odd sent its own elected members to sit in Parliament at Westminster. Few small ports held that honor. Its burgesses traveled south by ship and road, representing a town barely decades old. Records from the Reign list its representatives among coastal boroughs granted the same voice as older cities. The privilege would not last long. Let warmth begin low, in your feet, and rise from there. Imagine it moving up through your ankles, into your calves, easing the muscles as it climbs. It reaches your knees, your thighs, gathering there like late afternoon sun on stone. Let it climb into your chest, into your shoulders, until your whole body feels lit from within. Breathe out. Let it climb into your jaw, behind your eyes, and rest there. Ravensor-Odd's harbor once rivaled nearby Hull for trade along the coast. Customs rolls from the period, record wine from Gascony, timber from Norway, and salted fish bound for London kitchens. Tolls collected there matched those of larger ports up the coast. Its wharves rarely stood empty. Guild merchants kept counting houses along the quay, tallying cargo by lantern light long after the market closed. Repeated storms through the 1300s stripped away Ravensor-Odd's sandbank piece by piece. Waves carried off streets merchants had only recently paved. Houses nearest the shoreline were dismantled and moved inland before the tide could claim them. The graveyard went first. Sailors passing later swore they could still glimpse gravestones beneath the swell. The town of Ravensor-Odd had vanished entirely by the century's end, swallowed whole by the shifting Humber mouth. Ships that had called there for 2 generations found only open water and a stronger current. Local chroniclers noted the loss in a single dry line. Nothing rose again on that spot. Old Winchelsea stood on the Sussex coast long before a series of storms remade its shoreline. It was one of England's chief ports, its harbor thick with wine ships from Bordeaux. Streets ran close to the water's edge, lined with merchant houses and a parish church. The town paid heavy taxes to the crown for its trade. None of it seemed fragile then. One great storm redirected a river and drowned much of Old Winchelsea within a single night. The river rather shifted its course, cutting a new channel through what had been dry ground. Waves followed the water inland, flooding cellars and streets built for trade, not defense. By morning, parts of the old town lay under the tide. Rebuilding there was impossible. Surviving townspeople rebuilt Winchelsea on higher ground inland, a mile or so from the drowned streets. King Edward I granted land and funds for the new settlement. Carpenters and masons laid out fresh foundations on a hilltop above the marsh. Some families carried salvaged timber from the old town. It would flood far less. Grid streets of New Winchelsea still follow a medieval town plan laid out in the 1280s. Its wide rectangular blocks were designed for wagons and wool carts, not foot traffic alone. Modern visitors can walk the same corners drawn by royal surveyors centuries ago. The sea now lies far off, its old harbor silted into farmland long ago. Broom Hill in Kent lost its harbor to shifting shingle. The port had once loaded wool and grain onto ships bound for the near continent. Over generations, banks of shingle crept along the coast, pushed by tides and prevailing winds. The channel narrowed year by year. Boats grew too large for water gone thin. By the 17th century, Broom Hill's harbor existed only in old charters and fading memory. One entry in a 14th century tax roll listed harbor dues for a port no longer standing on land. Clerks in a county office copied the same figures year after year. Nothing on the page noted any change. The port's name remained long after its wharves had gone under sand and tide. Historians tracing the roll found no later record of ships arriving there. The name stayed, the port did not. Runholt sat on the coast of North Frisia, a trading settlement known for its wealth. Merchants there dealt in wool, wheat, and amber carried down from Baltic ports. The town held churches, warehouses, and a harbor busy with flat-bottomed boats suited to shallow tidal channels. Dikes and drainage ditches kept the low farmland dry for grazing cattle. Its wealth depended on that balance. Let your shoulders loosen and drop, the way a candle flame narrows into one low ember before it fades. There is no task waiting in that dimming light, only the last hour of a day already spent. Your breath can move like that small flame, smaller and slower with each turn. Whatever thought still glows can be left to burn down on its own. It asks nothing of you. Sleep is only the dark that follows. Cattle markets in Rungholt drew traders from along the coast on set days each season. Local rhyme later remembered the town's church bells, said to ring across 11 parishes on clear mornings. Verses passed through generations named streets, wells, and a harbor gate long after the buildings themselves were gone. No manuscript recorded its age. It survived instead in speech, carried by fishermen and farmers who never saw the town whole. Winds gathered over the North Sea in January of 1362. In a storm later named the Groot Mandrinke, it struck the coasts of England, the Netherlands, and the Frisian Islands within the same week. Dikes, built to hold back ordinary tides, gave way under sustained gale winds. Church towers along the shoreline became the only visible landmarks for days. Its name meant the Great Drowning. Rungholt disappeared beneath that same tide, its dikes overrun within hours. Chroniclers in neighboring regions noted the loss of a wealthy trading town along the Frisian coast. No first-hand account survived. Farmland, houses, and the church with its remembered bells went under mud and seawater together. The North Sea took on the shape of a new bay where fields had been. Fields around the Wadden Sea still yield fragments of Rungholt's brick foundations at very low tide. Farmers walking the mudflats have long collected broken pottery, worked stone, and pieces of old drainage pipe. Marine archaeologists mapped these scattered fragments across a wide stretch of tidal flat. The tide always returns. The bricks, dark red against pale mud, mark where streets once ran. Excavations in the 20th century found rows of post holes beneath the mudflats, confirming Rungholt's exact location after generations of dispute. Wooden posts had once supported houses built on low mounds above the regular tide line. Archaeologists mapped the pattern using aerial photographs taken during the lowest tides of the year. The layout matched descriptions passed down in local rhyme. The guesswork finally ended. Reamerswal in Zeeland lost its harbor gradually, first to silting, then to floods that followed one after another across 2 centuries. The town had once ranked among the busiest ports in the region, its quay stacked with grain and salt. Storm floods eroded the surrounding embankments piece by piece, each one taking more land than the last. Merchants left for towns with harbors still deep enough for trade. The tide kept what remained. Reamerswal's town hall stood empty long after most residents had left. Its chambers had once held merchants weighing grain and paying debts. Officials kept recording decisions there for years after the harbor beside it fell silent. Rain crept through cracked plaster. The unglazed windows looked out over mudflats where boats had once docked. Few remained to hear the verdicts read aloud. The last building in Reamerswal fell into the estuary in the 17th century. By then, only a handful of houses remained standing above the waterline. Floodwaters had carried away streets, gardens, and the old market cross piece by piece over many decades. A single wall held on longest. When it finally gave way, no chronicler thought it worth more than a passing line. The town's name stayed on old maps, marking open water. Saftinga was once called the drowned land of Siftinga, though for a time it had been solid, cultivated ground. Farmers grew grain behind low earthen dikes near the Skelt estuary. Cattle grazed the polders. Scattered farmhouses stood between drainage ditches and canals. The name given afterward described what the land became, not what it once was. Older maps show fields where open water now spreads. Polders around Saftinga flooded during the St. Elizabeth's flood in the year 1420. Dikes along the Skelt gave way during a winter storm that struck much of the surrounding lowland. Villages and farmland disappeared beneath the rising estuary within a single night. Survivors fled toward higher ground inland. The flood reshaped the shoreline for centuries afterward, and Seftinge never returned to farmland. Let your jaw loosen now, the small hinge behind each ear releasing its hold. Notice how heavy your eyelids have become, heavier than you have let them be all day. There is a kind of dark that gathers behind closed eyes, deep and unhurried, like water finding its own level. Let your forehead smooth, line by line, until nothing there needs holding up. Your breath can slow on its own. You do not need to guide it. Rest here, in that soft dark, for as long as you like. Grazing marshes now cover what were once Saftinge's farmhouses. Sheep and geese cross ground that once held kitchens and barns. Reed beds spread wide. Tidal channels have replaced fences and cart paths. Only scattered raised mounds hint at where buildings stood. Naturalists manage the marsh today as protected wetland, drawn by the same tides that undid the fields long before them. Dutch villages along the Zuider Zee were abandoned as the inland sea widened over the centuries. Storms repeatedly breached the low dikes guarding farmland near its shifting edges. Fishing hamlets that once faced sheltered water found themselves exposed to open, restless tide. Houses moved, plank by plank. Others resettled entirely on drier ground inland, leaving little behind but a name on a map. Windmills once pumped water from land the sea eventually reclaimed. Their sails turned day and night, lifting water from ditches into higher canals to keep fields dry. Millers lived beside their machines. Gears and sailcloth needed constant tending through every season. Some polders held for generations under this steady effort. Others lost the fight when storms outpaced what the mills could lift away. A church tower buried beneath a Dutch polder was uncovered during drainage work in the 19th century. Laborers digging new channels struck brick and mortar far below the topsoil, more solid than any field stone. Local records were consulted, and the structure matched a parish lost to flooding generations earlier. Excavators cleared enough of the tower to confirm its shape and the churchyard around it. The find answered a question the village had carried for years. Tanter Gwelad is remembered in Welsh legend as a low country lost to the sea. Storytellers described a fertile realm guarded by dikes and sluice gates along what is now Cardigan Bay. In the old tale, a keeper failed to close the gates one stormy night. The sea poured in. Bells were said to ring from drowned towers during rough weather afterward. No written record from that early period survives to confirm the tale's details. Welsh tradition places Cantor Gwaelad's remains beneath Cardigan Bay, somewhere between the modern shoreline and the deeper channel offshore. Fishermen once pointed toward the water at low tide, naming submerged fields their grandfathers had named before them. No single spot has ever been fixed as the Lost Realm's true center. The bay simply holds the story the way it holds the tide. Petrified tree stumps still emerge from the sand at low tide near Borth, blackened and hard as stone after thousands of years underwater. Storms strip away the covering sand every so often, revealing root systems still gripping the old soil beneath them. Botanists have identified pine, oak, and birch among the remains. Walkers cross the exposed forest floor for a few hours before the tide returns. Then the sand closes over it again, patient as ever. Kenfig in South Wales was buried by drifting sand rather than water alone, though the sea supplied the wind that carried it. Dunes crept steadily inland across the centuries, swallowing streets one house at a time. Residents shoveled sand from their doorways for generations before giving up entirely. By the 16th century, the borough had shrunk to little more than a scattering of roofs among the hills of sand. Kenfig's church and castle ruins were slowly swallowed by encroaching dunes, their stonework disappearing behind grass-topped mounds. The castle keep stood exposed the longest, its broken tower visible above the sand for years after the rest had vanished. Local families kept grazing rights on the surrounding common long after the town itself had gone quiet. A single pool near the dunes still carries the name of the vanished settlement. The Cardigan Bay stone rows are visible only when storms strip away sand, revealing lines of dark stones laid across the tidal flats. Archaeologists have studied their arrangement without full agreement on their original purpose. Some read them as fish traps built long before written record. Others connect them to the same drowned land stories told about the wider bay. The rows returned to hiding within weeks, buried again by ordinary tides. Let the exhale run a little longer than the breath that came before it, and notice how the body settles further with each release. There is no need to guide it, only to let it happen, the way a tide falls back without effort. Feel the chest loosen, the ribs widen and ease. Each breath now asks less of you than the one before. Let this rhythm carry you, unnoticed, further into rest. Brittany's coast holds tales of a city called Is taken by the tide, a place said to have stood behind great sea walls on the edge of the Atlantic. Storytellers described broad streets and a king's palace protected by locked gates against the water. In the old telling, the gates were opened in error during a storm, and the sea claimed the city whole. No archaeological trace of Is has ever been confirmed along the Breton shore. Breton fishermen once claimed church bells from Is rang before storms, carried up from beneath the waves on the wind ahead of bad weather. The sound was passed along as a warning worth heeding, whatever its true source. Some listeners heard it in the surf against rock, others in the wind through sea caves. The belief held on in fishing families long after the tale of the city itself had faded from daily talk. Eyemouth on the Scottish coast lost boats and shorefront buildings to a single storm on an October morning in 1881. The fleet had put out early despite a poor sky, following the pull of the herring season. Within hours, the wind turned violent, driving vessels onto rocks within sight of the harbor. Families watched from the shore as boats broke apart close enough to see but too far to reach. Parish burial records listed the Eyemouth fishermen lost that day, names entered in careful ink by a clergyman working through a grim week. The register showed entire families reduced to widows and fatherless children within a single town. Historians studying the parish books later matched names against crew lists from local boats. The paper has outlasted the boats themselves, still kept in the town's local archive. Villages along Ireland's Atlantic coast were resettled inland after repeated flooding wore away their fields and roads. Cottages near Galway and Clare had stood close to the shore for generations, their walls built from local stone and thatch cut from nearby bogs. Storms rolling in off the open ocean pushed salt water into wells and gardens, souring the soil for years afterward. Families moved their belongings by cart to higher ground, leaving old foundations to the tide and the grass. Dublin's shoreline shifted over centuries as land reclamation altered the old channels of the River Liffey. Mudflats and marshes that once flooded with the tide were filled with rubble, timber, and ballast from arriving ships. Wharves crept further into the bay with each generation of building. Streets that sailors once remembered as open water now sit well back from the harbor's edge. Port Royal in Jamaica stood as a busy harbor town built on a narrow spit of sand at the mouth of Kingston Harbor. Warehouses, taverns, and merchant houses crowded close together along streets barely wide enough for a cart. Ships from across the Atlantic anchored in its deep natural harbor, drawn by trade and by the town's reputation for quick fortunes. By the late 17th century, it had become one of the busiest ports in the English Caribbean. Port Royal's warehouses held sugar, rum, and goods gathered from across the Caribbean, stacked in barrels along wharves that smelled of tar and molasses. Merchants kept ledgers of cargo bound for England and for other island ports. Enslaved laborers loaded and unloaded much of what passed through the harbor, work that filled the town's days from early light to dusk. Silver from Spanish wrecks sometimes found its way through the same crowded streets. An earthquake struck Port Royal on a June afternoon in 1692, shaking the harbor town without warning. Church bells swung on their own, and dust rose from cracking plaster along the crowded streets. Ships in the harbor rocked as the ground beneath the wharves gave way in places. Within minutes, much of the town's foundation had begun to fail beneath its own buildings. Much of Port Royal's waterfront slid directly into the harbor that same afternoon, streets and warehouses sinking beneath the water almost as they stood. Wharves that had held ships for cargo now lay submerged with their pilings still upright. Survivors on higher ground watched buildings disappear in sections, roofs last to go under. What had been the busiest quarter of the town became, within hours, part of the harbor floor. Let the weight of the evening settle into your legs first. Ankles heavy, knees loosening, like old hinges finally allowed to rest. Feel that same heaviness climb slowly upward, into the thighs, into the hips, as though the mattress were rising gently to meet you, rather than the other way around. Let it reach your chest next, a warm pressure settling there without any need to hold it up. And when it reaches your arms, let your hands simply stop trying to do anything at all. Surviving merchants rebuilt on the same spit within a few years, raising new warehouses over the drowned foundations of the old ones. Timber came from ships broken apart for salvage, and stone from buildings too damaged to save. Trade returned slowly, drawn back by the harbor's depth and its familiar position on old shipping routes. The rebuilt town never matched its former size, but it endured for generations after. Divers exploring Port Royal's harbor in the 20th century found streets and brick foundations resting beneath layers of silt. Cobblestone lanes ran in straight lines along the seabed, still following the town's original grid. House walls stood in places to shoulder height, doorways framed by drifting sand. Archaeologists mapped the site as one of the few sunken towns preserved largely intact beneath calm water. A recovered pocket watch from Port Royal's harbor had its hands stopped near the hour the earthquake struck. Divers found it lodged among timber and brick close to where a merchant's house once stood. The case had corroded, but the mechanism inside preserved its final position through 3 centuries of silt and tide. Museum records later cited the watch as one of the clearest markers of the exact hour the town went under. Clay pipes and pewter plates still surface after storms, stir the harbor floor near Port Royal. Fishermen, dredging close to the old wharf, have pulled up tankards stamped with English makers' marks, bowls worn smooth by centuries of tide. Each storm loosens more silt, exposing fragments of ordinary kitchens lost beneath the water, a broken plate, a bent spoon. These small objects outlast the walls that once held them, scattered now across a seabed shaped like a street. Japan's coastline has lived alongside tsunami risk for longer than written memory reaches. Fishing villages along its eastern shore built their lives around narrow inlets and steep hillsides, chosen as much for safety as for convenience. Waves born of distant earthquakes have struck this coast again and again across recorded centuries. The sea gave, the sea also took. Elders passed the danger down in songs and proverbs, long before anyone wrote it in a book. Stone markers still stand along Japan's coast, placed there by survivors of past tsunami. Carved in some cases centuries ago, they mark the highest point water reached and warn descendants not to build below that line. The stones waited. Some villages honored the warning for generations, moving fields and shrines uphill instead of houses. Others eventually built downhill anyway, drawn back by fertile land and easy harbor access, until the water returned to remind them why the stones were carved. The word tsunami entered English through Japanese fishing communities, borrowed rather than translated. It joins 2 characters meaning harbor and wave, a name born from villages that watch their anchorages fill and empty in strange rhythm. Foreign sailors and scholars adopted the term during the 19th century, finding no equal phrase in their own tongues. The word carried into English dictionaries largely unchanged. It still names, in every language that borrowed it, the same old danger. Along China's eastern coastline, villages have been resettled more than once after typhoon flooding tore through fishing settlements. Low-lying communities near the delta and the southern coast rebuilt farther from tidal marshes after repeated storm surges reached their fields. Provincial records from recent centuries note relocations following major typhoons, some chosen, some ordered. Farmland reclaimed from the sea proved fertile but exposed. Many families moved more than once within a single generation. Land beneath parts of coastal Jakarta has sunk far enough that whole districts now sit below sea level. Groundwater drawn up for decades left empty spaces underground, and the soil settled downward under its own weight. Seawalls along the shoreline require constant raising to keep pace with the sinking ground. Fishing villages at the city's edge have flooded during ordinary high tides, not storms. Some streets flood on clear days now, with no storm at all. Fishing communities near the Ganges Delta have moved inland more than once within a single lifetime. Rivers here shift course across the delta's soft silt, and islands form and dissolve within a few decades. Families have rebuilt homes on new sandbanks, only to watch the water reclaim them years later. Salt water pushing farther inland has ruined fields that once grew rice. Migration here is not one event, but a habit passed from parents to children. Somewhere far off, a sound moves through the walls and then fades, wind maybe, or a pipe settling into its old frame. Let it pass through you the way it passes through the house, asking nothing of you at all. Feel your ribs rise and fall in their own slow rhythm, unconnected to that far sound. This room is enough. If the sound returns, let it arrive like something already familiar, already forgiven, already gone before it means anything at all. 19th century tide gauge records first showed certain delta villages sinking, long before anyone spoke of it in modern terms. Engineers installed the gauges to track shipping channels and harbor depths, not to study land loss. Readings taken over decades along the Ganges Delta and the Gulf Coast showed water levels rising against fixed benchmarks year after year. Later researchers, comparing those old ledgers to modern satellite data, found the earliest signs of subsidence already recorded in careful handwritten columns. Holland Island once supported a thriving farming and fishing community in Chesapeake Bay. By the late 1800s, it held homes, a school, a church, and a general store, serving several hundred residents. Crops from its soil reached markets on the Maryland mainland. Erosion had already begun. Families watched their fields shrink, season by season, long before anyone thought to call it a warning. One last house on Holland Island stood against the water long after its neighbors were gone. Paint peeled from its clapboard walls. Its porch leaned toward the bay, and each high tide chewed further into the sandy rise beneath the foundation. People from the mainland sometimes crossed by boat just to see it still standing. It finally fell into the water on an October afternoon in 2010. Tangier Island, a short boat ride north of Holland Island's old ground, has lost significant acreage to erosion over the past century. Watermen still work these docks. Streets named for old families now run close to the tide line. Some homes have been shifted back from crumbling banks more than once. Maps drawn a century ago show a shoreline that no longer exists. Louisiana's coastal parishes have watched whole named islands vanish from maps within living memory. Cypress roots and marsh grass once held the land together against the Gulf's push. Channels cut for oil and gas sped the loss further. The land kept slipping away. Fishing camps built on stilts now stand over open water, and some place names persist on charts long after the ground beneath them is gone. Isle de Jean Charles, home to a native community along the Louisiana coast, watched its land erode away year by year. Families there trace descent from Biloxi, Chickamauga, and Choctaw ancestors who settled the island generations ago. The island kept narrowing. A single flood-prone road once connected it to the mainland. As dry ground grew scarce, most residents accepted a state-funded relocation to higher ground, though a few chose to remain on what was left. Nautical charts drawn decades apart told the same story without a single word of explanation. Surveyors working for the Coast Survey measured the same stretch of Louisiana shoreline in different years. Laid side by side, the charts showed bays widening and points retreating where solid ground had once been marked. Cartographers simply redrew the line where the water now reached. No note explained the change. The ink alone recorded it. Newtok, a village on Alaska's western coast, moved its people after the frozen ground beneath it gave way. The Ninglick River had eaten steadily at the bluff for years, and the permafrost holding the soil together no longer stayed frozen through summer. Homes tilted as the ground softened. Boardwalks buckled where children once played. Families began relocating to a new site called Mertervik, built on firmer rock across the water. Shishmaref, a village on a barrier island off Alaska's northwest coast, voted to relocate as its shoreline narrowed. Sea ice that once formed early and held through winter began arriving later each year, leaving the coast exposed to autumn storms. Waves cut into the bluff, where homes and a school once stood safely back from the water. Residents voted more than once on where to move. The choice was never simple. Native communities along Louisiana's bayous carried seasonal flooding knowledge across many generations. Elders taught younger family members to read watercolor, wind direction, and the behavior of herons before a storm's arrival. Homes were built with removable floors and furniture that could be lifted quickly to higher shelves. Boats stayed tied close at hand. This knowledge, older than written records in the region, still guides some families today. Let warmth gather now in your hands, wherever they happen to rest. Feel it pool there, like sunlight caught in a shallow dish, spreading toward the wrists. Nothing else matters now. Let that same warmth climb the arms, easing each small muscle in turn until it settles across your chest like a blanket someone has pulled up for you. Let your breathing widen to make room for it, and let the long night ahead ask nothing of you at all. The Netherlands began building dikes to hold back the sea many centuries ago. Early settlers on the low delta raised mounds of earth called turpen to keep homes above flood level. The work never really stopped. As farming spread across reclaimed marshland, villages joined together to build longer earthen walls along exposed coasts. Windmills eventually joined the effort, lifting water from drained land into narrow canals. Each generation added height and length to walls raised by the one before. Waterboards took shape in the Low Countries centuries before any national government claimed responsibility for flood defense. Villages elected their own overseers, men who inspected dikes and levied small fees for repair work. Fines were recorded for neighbors who let a stretch of embankment fall into disrepair. Meetings were held in parish halls, ledgers kept by candlelight. The system outlasted kingdoms. Engineers sealed off the great inland sea, known as the Zuiderzee, during the 20th century, closing it behind a long causeway of sand and clay. What had been open water for centuries became a freshwater lake, later drained in places to create new farmland. Whole villages that once faced tides found themselves landlocked. Fishermen retrained as farmers. The change came within a single working lifetime. Flooding overwhelmed dikes across Zeeland and the southwestern Netherlands in 1953, when a storm surge pushed far past what the old earthworks were built to hold. Whole polders filled with seawater overnight. Farmhouses stood roof, deep by morning. Cattle stranded on rooftops and dike crests. Relief boats moved through flooded lanes for weeks afterward. The disaster reshaped how the country measured risk. England raised seawalls along its eastern coast after generations of losses to storms and shifting shorelines. Stone and timber revetments went up outside towns that had already watched neighboring villages disappear. Local parishes contributed labor and materials, much as Dutch communities had done abroad. Maintenance never really ended. Each winter tested what the previous summer had built. Groins and breakwaters were added along English shores to slow the steady pull of erosion. Wooden groins ran out from the beach like ribs, trapping sand that would otherwise drift away with the current. Breakwaters offshore broke the force of larger waves before they reached the cliffs. Neither stopped the sea entirely. They only bought the shoreline more time. Villages along the Suffolk coast still watch their cliffs give way a little more each year. Fields that once held farmhouses now end abruptly at a crumbling edge above the tide. Surveyors mark the retreat with stakes driven into the turf, moved back after every storm season. Some residents remember exact distances lost within their own lifetimes. The land keeps its own slow ledger. Managed retreat has become policy in places where the cost of holding back the sea outweighs the value of the land itself. Certain low fields and old grazing marshes are now allowed to flood on purpose, returning to salt marsh rather than staying behind failing walls. Birds have moved back into channels once drained for farming. Planners call it a return rather than a loss. The tide in these places has simply been let back in. Engineering ledgers from the Zuiderzee project recorded the exact tonnage of stone and clay hauled to close the Great Causeway. Barge after barge unloaded material along a line marked by survey stakes across open water. Clerks tallied deliveries by the day, weighing wagons at yards along the route. Those figures survived in municipal archives long after the workers who filled the barges were gone. The numbers alone tell how much a sea can be asked to hold back. Venice has met rising water with barriers raised at the mouths of its lagoon. Steel gates, lowered onto the seabed in calm weather, rise during high tides to hold the Adriatic back from the city's canals. Engineers watch weather reports the way farmers once watched the sky before harvest. The lagoon's ancient balance between land and water shifts a little further each decade. Venice keeps adjusting rather than surrendering. Let the house around you settle now, the way old timber settles once the day's weight has finally left it. Somewhere, a beam shifts faint and low, and then goes still again. You don't need to listen for it. Let your own frame do the same, joint by joint, the way a house lets go of the sun it carried all afternoon. There is only this room now, and the dark holding it gently in place. Planning for Venice's flood barrier began decades before the first gate ever rose from the seabed. Engineers studied the lagoon's tides for years, testing models of currents and storm surges in scaled basins built to mimic the real water. Politics slowed construction as often as weather did. Contracts changed hands, budgets stretched across governments. By the time the barrier finally worked as designed, the plans themselves had grown older than some of the workers who built it. Stone doorways in Venice's oldest buildings carry faint lines above their thresholds, each one marking a flood that reached a little higher than the last. Shopkeepers along the canals have learned to read these marks the way farmers once read a well's water level. Some lines date back generations, pressed into marble that has otherwise barely changed. A grandmother's flood is still visible beneath a grandson's doorbell. Archaeologists searching for drowned villages no longer rely only on divers feeling their way through dark water. Sonar sweeps map the seabed shape from a boat's deck, revealing walls and ditches invisible from the surface. Drones skim low over shallow bays at low tide, photographing shapes that vanish again within the hour. The work now happens partly in the air, partly underwater, and partly on a screen in a quiet office far from the coast. Before a single stone is lifted from a sunken village, its position is measured, drawn, and numbered. Divers place markers along the seabed to build a grid, the same method used on land for centuries. Photographs are taken from dozens of angles before anything moves. Only after every fragment's place is recorded does the slow work of raising it begin. A drowned street, once mapped, can be rebuilt on paper long before it ever reaches daylight. A shipwreck, raised from the mud off the English coast, carried barrels stamped with a merchant's mark still legible after centuries underwater. Researchers matched that mark to a name in a surviving ledger kept by a trading house on shore, its pages listing cargo loaded the same season the ship went down. The ledger recorded weights, prices, and a destination the vessel never reached. Wreck and paper, parted for centuries, were read together again in a museum archive. Small museums along England's eastern coast hold quiet collections pulled from the tide over generations. Broken roof tiles sit beside rusted keys and fragments of medieval pottery, each labeled with the beach where it was found rather than the building it once belonged to. Visitors move slowly past glass cases, reading handwritten cards more than printed placards. The sea gave these objects up piece by piece, long after the villages that made them were gone. Fishermen working the shallow waters off Suffolk still occasionally haul up roof tiles tangled in their nets, orange clay worn smooth by centuries of tide. Most are broken, some are whole, and none carry any mark of the house they once covered. Crews toss them aside as often as they keep them, treating the find as ordinary as a stone or shell. The sea, in that stretch of coast, has never fully stopped returning what it took. Old maps of England's eastern shore still carry names for villages that no longer have any land beneath them. A chart from centuries past might mark a church, a market cross, or a row of houses at a spot now covered entirely by open sea. Sailors once used these names to navigate by memory as much as by sight. Today, the names remain printed on modern charts too, quiet labels for water where streets once ran. Parish registers along England's coast sometimes end without warning, their final pages listing baptisms and burials in a hand that simply stops. Historians tracing certain villages find no entries at all for the years after a great storm struck, the records either lost with the church or never written again. Neighboring parishes absorbed what remained of the congregation, folding old names quietly into new books. The silence in the register says as much as any surviving line. A tithe map drawn in the 1700s for a coastal parish showed neat fields, hedgerows, and farmhouses stretching toward a shoreline marked in faded ink. Surveyors had walked every boundary to record who owed what for which strip of land. Comparing that map to the coast today, much of what it charted now lies beneath open water at high tide. The parchment itself survived far longer than the fields it was drawn to describe. Let the muscles around your eyes lose their grip now, the fine lines at each corner going smooth in the dark behind closed lids. Feel your eyelids finally answer gravity, no longer holding themselves half open against the day. Your brow can spread wide and flat, the way a tide spreads flat across sand it once gripped tightly. Whatever tension gathered in your face through these hours can drain now, down through your jaw, down through your throat, and away. Storm surges along the North Sea remain something coastal towns still plan around every winter. Harbor masters watch weather, charts the way their predecessors once watched clouds and gull flight. Seawalls, sandbag stores, and warning sirens sit ready in towns from Norfolk to the Netherlands. Nobody there treats the sea as finished with the land. The old danger never fully left, only changed its shape. London now sits behind a barrier built to stop the surge that once drowned villages like Ravensor Odd. Steel gates across the Thames can rise within minutes, closing the river against a rushing tide. Engineers test the mechanism regularly, long before any storm arrives. The barrier's silver piers look almost ordinary in daylight, more like sculpture than defense. Beneath that calm surface sit centuries of hard lessons about water and low ground. Coastal erosion rates are measured yearly now along much of Britain's eastern shore, in meters lost rather than guessed at. Surveyors walk the same cliff edges each season, driving stakes and comparing distances to the year before. Some stretches lose only a little. Others lose whole gardens, fences, and footpaths within a single winter. The measurements sit quietly in council reports, filed and rarely read. Yet they record, almost year by year, the same slow loss that swallowed Dunwich centuries earlier. Some medieval harbor towns left nothing behind but their name, carried inland to a village that never touched water. A hamlet a few miles from the coast might still be called by a word meaning ferry, or landing, or ford, long after any boat could reach it. Local people rarely ask why, treating the name as simply the name of home. Only an old map, laid beside the modern one, shows what the word used to mean. Cartographers across the centuries kept redrawing the same stretch of coastline as old ports silted shut or eroded away entirely. A chart from one generation might show a thriving harbor mouth. A chart from the next shows a straight, unbroken shore. Surveyors rarely wrote why the change occurred, only that it had. Stacked together, their maps trace the coast's slow retreat far more plainly than any single chronicler ever managed. Legends of bells ringing beneath the waves turn up along coastlines that have never been near one another. Fishermen off Dunwich told of tolling under the water during storms. Villagers near the Frisian coast said the same of Rungholt's lost church bells. Neither community likely ever heard the other's story. The tale seems to rise wherever a town has vanished into the sea, as if grief needed one shape to travel in. Folklore of drowned villages appears from Wales to Brittany to the low islands of Frisia, each telling its own version of the same old grief. Welsh voices spoke of Cantargwelad sunk beneath Cardigan Bay. Breton voices spoke of Is taken by a careless flood. Frisian voices spoke of Rungholt swallowed whole in a single terrible night. The details differ, the losses match. Storms battering the medieval North Sea often clustered in the same unlucky stretch of years, rather than spreading evenly across the centuries. Chroniclers, writing in the 12 and 1300s, described flood after flood arriving within a single lifetime. Dunwich, Ravensor-Odd, and villages across Frisia all suffered within that same rough window. Weather historians studying tree rings and tide records have found evidence of a genuinely stormier climate through those years. The coast, it seems, simply had worse luck for a while. Timber pulled from a drowned harbor once carried its own calendar inside it, ring by ring. Scientists studying growth patterns in the recovered wood were able to match it against known tree ring sequences from the region. The comparison placed the timber's felling within a single specific decade, centuries closer to certainty than any local legend allowed. A beam that storms had buried in silt for generations turned out to hold a more precise date than the chroniclers ever wrote down. Ground-penetrating radar now lets researchers find a village's buried foundations without disturbing the soil above them. A pulse sent into the earth bounces back differently from packed clay, from stone, from the hollow of an old cellar. Archaeologists working the Suffolk coast have traced streets under pasture that farmers walked over for generations without knowing. No shovel touches the ground. The old town stays exactly where it was left, mapped rather than moved. Notice your breath now, without trying to change it. It moves in and out on its own, the way tide moves without asking permission. Feel the small pause at the top where nothing needs to happen next. Let that pause widen, just slightly, each time it returns. There is a rhythm older than any thought you are having tonight, older than the room around you, and it has been carrying you all along. Rest inside it now, and let the rest of you follow it down. Satellite instruments now track coastline change that once demanded a chronicler's careful eye and years of patient watching. Radar altimetry measures sea level to within a few millimeters, repeated month after month across entire coastlines. Erosion that a medieval clerk might have noticed only after a church fell now shows in a data table before the first crack appears in any wall. The watching has grown faster than the water. Records that once took a lifetime update overnight now. Certain island communities have already begun drawing up formal plans for moving away from the water altogether. Officials in low-lying Pacific nations have discussed purchasing land abroad, should the sea keep rising as projected. Communities along the Chesapeake and parts of the Gulf Coast have held meetings about where a relocated village might stand. None of these plans assume urgency will arrive tomorrow. They assume it will arrive eventually and choose to be ready for it. Coastal museums along England's eastern shore keep cases of ordinary objects pulled from the mud at low tide. A leather shoe, half-rotted, sits beside a bent iron key that once locked a door long since gone. Wooden combs, their teeth still fine enough to draw through hair, rest under glass a few feet from where visitors buy tickets. None of these things are rare on their own. Together, laid out in a row, they read like a life someone walked away from in a hurry. Where a village has drowned, its well sometimes remains, a ring of fitted stone rising just above the sand at the lowest tide of the month. Divers off the Suffolk coast have found such rings still holding their shape after centuries underwater. The stones were cut and set by hands expecting the well to serve grandchildren, not to be found by strangers in wetsuits. Locals who fish those waters know exactly where to look. They call it by the old village's name, though the village itself is gone. Old road alignments sometimes continue straight out past the modern shoreline, visible as raised causeways beneath a few feet of water. A cart track that once carried grain to a harbor market can still be traced by its camber, the slight rise engineers built in to help rainwater drain away. Boats crossing at low tide occasionally scraped their hulls against the packed stone beneath them. The road never stopped being the road. The sea just stopped letting anyone walk it. Fields beneath certain sheltered bays still carry the ridges of medieval farming, faint stripes, visible only when the water lies flat and the light comes in low. Farmers once plowed those strips in long curved beds, a pattern called ridge and furrow that drained water away from the crop. Aerial photographs taken at the right tide and hour show the pattern clearly, a ghost of agriculture under a few feet of sea. The furrows never filled in. The water rises over them and drops away again on its own schedule. Church bells pulled from tidal mud sometimes still carry a founder's name, stamped into the bronze by a bellmaker long before the tower it hung in gave way. The lettering runs in a band near the rim, worn smooth in places, but still legible under a careful hand. Bells from Rungholt's lost churches and from towns along the English coast have surfaced this way, identified not by legend but by their own metal. A bell does not forget who made it. The sea, it turns out, cannot erase a name cast in bronze. Dredging near the Frisian coast once brought up a bronze bell tangled with roots and shell, and a museum conservator traced the founder's mark stamped into its rim. The name matched an entry in a parish inventory, drawn up centuries earlier, listing the bells a lost church had once owned before the flood took it. The match settled a question local memory had never quite resolved: which church the bell belonged to, and where its tower had stood. Paper and bronze, kept apart for generations, agreed with each other at last. Petitions for sea defenses filled the record chests of coastal towns for centuries. Councils in Suffolk and Yorkshire wrote to the Crown asking for grants toward timber, stone, and labor. Some requests won a few pounds for a new groin or a stretch of piling. Many were refused outright, the Treasury citing wars closer to home. A harbor could lose more ground in one winter than a decade of petitions ever won back. Villages threatened by advancing water sometimes chose to move rather than wait for the sea to decide for them. Masons numbered each stone of a church or hall before taking it down, so it could rise again in the same order elsewhere. Timber frames were carted whole, beams still fitted with their old joints. Winchelsea's townspeople had already done this once, hauling what could be saved to higher ground. A house moved this way kept its shape, even after losing its view of the water. Let the weight of your body find the mattress now, one part following another. Start at your hips and let them settle deeper than they have all day, as if the bed had risen slightly to meet them. Let that heaviness spread up through your ribs, your chest, loosening its hold on each breath. Let it move down too, through your thighs, your knees, into the stillness of your feet. There is no need to hurry it. Let your whole frame grow heavier, layer by layer, until it feels less like resting and more like sinking into something that has been waiting for you all along. Villages facing the loss of their land did not always take everything with them. Churchyards near the tide line sometimes eroded before anyone could move the graves inside them, and what could not be carried was left to the water. At Dunwich, coffins and headstones fell from crumbling cliffs onto the beach below, gathered afterward by parishioners and reburied in whatever ground remained. Grief there was practical as much as sorrowful, measured out in cartloads. The sea kept only what could not be lifted in time. Storms have gone on, uncovering the dead long after the villages themselves disappeared. Along England's eastern coast, a heavy tide can strip away enough sand or clay to expose old burial grounds no map still marks. Archaeologists called to such finds record each skeleton's position before lifting it, noting posture and depth. The remains are usually reburied further inland. In ground, the water is unlikely to reach again soon. A church gone for centuries can still, briefly, ask for a new grave. Parish clergy in vulnerable coastal towns once held services asking directly for protection from the sea. Special prayers were read before winter storm season, sometimes alongside the blessing of boats and nets. Bishops in the medieval dioceses of Norwich and Canterbury approved such rites for parishes that had already lost land within living memory. The words asked plainly for the water to stay where it was. Whether the prayers were answered depended entirely on the winter that followed. Coastal risk carried a price long before insurance companies existed to calculate it. In towns like Dunwich and Ravensor, merchants paid higher rents and tolls to trade from land known to be unstable. Guild records from Hanseatic ports show harbor fees adjusted for towns whose channels silted or shifted year to year. A warehouse on eroding ground was worth less, and everyone who lent money against it knew it. Risk was priced in coin, long before it was priced in policy. Certain drowned villages left almost nothing behind except a single deed, a parchment recording the sale of land, a marriage settlement, or a grant of fishing rights sometimes names a place no later document ever mentions again. Historians trace where such villages stood from field boundaries described in the deed itself. A furlong here, a hedge there. Without that one surviving sheet, some coastal settlements would have no record at all. A signature and a wax seal can outlast the ground it was written about. Aerial photographs taken just after an especially low tide have revealed field boundaries no one standing on the shore could ever see. Shadows cast by a low winter sun catch the slight ridges of old hedgerows and drainage ditches lying just beneath the sand. Archaeologists studying the Suffolk and Norfolk coast have used these images to map entire farm layouts swallowed generations ago. The patterns show for only a few hours before the tide returns to cover them again. A camera overhead can catch in one frame what a walker would need a lifetime to notice. Soil cores drilled near Broomhill's old harbor settled a long-standing question about where its channel once ran. Geologists drew up narrow columns of earth, layer by layer, reading the sediment like pages stacked over centuries. A band of fine silt and shell fragments, buried well beneath the current fields, matched exactly what a tidal channel leaves behind. The cores confirmed what the old tax roll had only implied, that ships once passed through ground now planted with barley. Stone, mud, and paper, this time, were finally in agreement. Not every drowned village has been found again. Divers and sonar crews have searched suspected sites off Suffolk and the Frisian coast for decades. Some locations named in old deeds correspond to nothing but open seabed today. Winter currents shift the sand there, burying whatever a survey uncovered the year before. A few sites remain unconfirmed. The sea keeps some of its answers to itself. No one knows exactly how many English coastal settlements the sea has taken. Estimates drawn from old maps, church records, and local tradition range widely and rarely agree on a final count. Some lists include hamlets that simply moved rather than drowned. Others count only places named in royal charters. A single storm might account for several settlements at once, blurring the tally further. The number stays open. Coastal historians describe a long, uneven loss rather than a fixed figure. Maps drawn a century apart often disagree about where a lost harbor once stood. A chart from the 1600s might place a channel mouth a mile from where a later survey draws it. Coastlines shifted gradually enough that mapmakers working decades apart were both, in their own time, correct. Later surveyors sometimes corrected earlier guesses using local memory rather than measurement. Layer by layer, the disagreements themselves became a kind of record. Only the water knows for certain. Somewhere out past the window, a faux horn sounds once, then fades into the dark. Let that fading be the shape of your own breath now, rising just enough to be heard, then settling back into stillness. Let your chest loosen with each exhale. the ribs widening and falling like something finally set down. There is a slowness in you that does not need tending, only permission. Let your spine sink into whatever is holding it, one small bone at a time. Rest here, unclaimed by anything the day still wants from you. Some communities kept the same church dedication when they rebuilt inland. A parish that lost its church to the sea might raise a new one further from the shore under the same saint's name. The bells, when they could be saved, sometimes traveled with the congregation to the new site. Records from Suffolk and Norfolk list churches rebuilt inland decades after the original had fallen, still bearing the same dedication. The building moved, the devotion did not. Fisherfolk's superstitions about drowned villages shaped safe fishing routes for generations. Sailors along the Suffolk and Frisian coasts once avoided certain stretches of water said to hold sunken church towers or old well shafts. Nets caught on submerged rubble more often in those spots, giving old warnings a practical edge alongside their folklore. Fathers taught sons which patches to skirt long before any chart marked a hazard there. The warnings were often accurate. Belief and caution in those waters were nearly the same thing. Every coastal culture seems to keep some memory of a village the sea once took. From Welsh chapels to Frisian farmsteads to fishing towns along the Ganges. Delta, the story repeats with local names and local details, but the same shape. A bell, a market square, a saint, something specific enough to be remembered and vague enough to be retold. The details change with each coastline. The shape of the loss does not. The pattern of slow loss and slower memory repeats from the Baltic to the tropics. A dune town in Wales, a delta hamlet near the Bay of Bengal, and a fishing post on the Chesapeake shore share almost nothing but geography and yet followed nearly the same arc. Land eroded a little each season. Families moved a little further inland each generation, and the old name lingered longest on a signpost or a family Bible. The water rarely announced itself with a single dramatic year. It preferred a slower method. Some lost villages are remembered only in a surname carried inland by descendants. Families who left a drowned settlement sometimes kept its name as their own, long after the place itself had gone underwater. Parish registers inland occasionally list a surname that matches no local place, only a coastal village recorded centuries earlier on a lost map. Genealogists tracing such names have, more than once, traced a family back to ground that no longer exists. A name outlived the address. It traveled where the houses could not. The sea's patience outlasts every wall built against it. Dikes, groins, breakwaters, and sea walls have slowed the water in places, sometimes for centuries at a stretch. None of them, so far, have stopped it entirely, only bought time, measured in generations, rather than forever. Engineers today speak of managed retreat instead of victory, a shift in language that admits what the old villages already knew. The tide does not tire, it simply keeps arriving. Coastal towns today measure their futures in centimeters of rising water, a unit that would have meant little to the people of Dunwich or Rungholt. Planning offices in low harbor towns now keep charts marked in small, careful increments, updated year by year. A road once safely inland gets a new sign warning of flooding within a lifetime. The measurements are modern. The worry behind them is not. The same tide that took Dunwich's streets still laps at Suffolk's beaches, patient in exactly the old way. Visitors walk the shingle where a cathedral city once stood, unaware they are standing above a market square. Fishermen there still speak of the sound the sea makes on certain nights, though most call it only wind and water now. The town is gone. The coastline keeps its shape a little longer each century, and then does not. Old charts, old bells, and old field marks are what remain of these towns, scattered thinly across museum shelves and parish drawers. A dredged bell without a church, a tithe map without a village, a surname without an address on any current map. None of these fragments tell a whole story by themselves. Together, laid side by side under lamplight, they outline villages that no living person ever walked through. The sea that swallowed these villages is the same sea visible from any quiet shore tonight, unchanged in its habits if not in its name. It took he-like in a single winter night, and Dunwich across 3 long centuries, and asked nothing different of either. Somewhere beyond this room, moonlight is falling on that same water, the way it fell on drowned bell towers and buried streets long before anyone thought to write it down. Let the sound of it be the last thing you carry into sleep tonight. Good night.